I'm assuming since you're on the webinar today that you're interested in elderberries, and if so, we're kindred spirits, and we're going to spend the next 90 minutes talking about all things elderberry. And what I have for you tonight, first of all, is a video on how to grow elderberries. I put this together when I could actually walk out into an elderberry planting and point to things and talk about things. So we'll look at that. Then I have a few comments related to making your elderberry plants as productive as they can be. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, both during the second part of the presentation and at the very end. So if you want to save your questions till the end, that's fine. If you want to ask them as we go along, I'll pause periodically and we'll tackle those. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Okay, I'm Patrick Byers, again, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. I'm based in Webster County, but I have the pleasure of serving 9 counties here in Southwest Missouri. And my interest in elderberries began when I was a very small child, and my mother sent me out with a bucket to pick elderberries so she can make elderberry jelly. And it's certainly grown since then. I've worked with them in a research and an extension setting since 1997. And it's been very exciting, very gratifying to see the development of Missouri's commercial elderberry industry. And elderberries are also a berry that is of huge interest by home gardeners. It's a beautiful plant. It produces not only berries, but a flower crop. And it also has utility from the standpoint of habitat management. It's a favored plant from the standpoint of pollinating insects and also beneficial insects. And it deserves a place in our naturalized plantings on our farms and in our gardens. As I mentioned, I work with University of Missouri Extension. I work with commercial horticulture, primarily with farmers who are looking towards horticulture as part of their income stream on their farms. I'm also a farmer. I have a farm in Webster County. And as I mentioned, I've been working with elderberries as co-director of the Missouri Elderberry Development Program since 1997. I do want to acknowledge my partner in tonight's presentation, Springfield Community Gardens. Springfield Community Gardens vision is a community where everyone has access to healthy local foods. And Springfield Community Gardens has several noteworthy projects underway in the greater Springfield area. These include a network of community gardens, a very innovative farmer incubator program, and also the development of a hospital garden at Cox Hospital. And so if you have any interest in the community garden scene in Springfield County, reach out to Springfield Community Gardens either through their website or through their YouTube presence. And then I also want to acknowledge our partners with the USDA. The USDA has provided funding to support our series of workshops, and several different grants are supporting the presentations. As Anna mentioned, we appreciate your feedback at the end of the presentation from the standpoint of how we did, and also to give us the feedback so we can improve. A number of USDA agencies are directly involved in supporting beginning farmers. These include the Farm Services Agency, the FSA, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, the Risk Management Agency, and also the Rural Development Agency. And information on all of these agencies is available at the farmers.gov resources website. So reach out. The USDA is certainly interested in supporting beginning farmers. So here's the outline of what we'll do tonight. As I mentioned, first we'll have a video overview of elderberry production, and then we'll talk about elderberry productivity. We'll talk about choosing cultivars, environmental issues in growing elderberries, choosing a good site in which to grow elderberries, cultural practices and productivity, pest management, productivity, and harvest management and productivity. And I want to give a huge shout out to Sherry Hagenhoff of Sac River Elderberry and Elderflower Farm. She was my partner in putting the video presentation together, and I certainly appreciate her participation. So let's watch a video. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, and I'm excited to be with you here today to talk about elderberry production. This video is intended to be a tool for people who are considering getting into elderberry production, but it also contains useful information for those who are already growing this exciting and profitable crop. We'll be talking about first some introductory material, then we'll talk about choosing a good site for elderberry production. We'll spend a bit of time talking about elderberry cultivars, then we'll talk about propagation and planting establishment and elderberry cultural practices, and then we'll finish with harvest and post-harvest handling. And sprinkled throughout this presentation will be a number of videos to help highlight points. I'm excited to be sharing with you today an interview with Sherry Hagenhoff of Sac River Valley Elderberry and Elderflower Farm, a very innovative elderberry farm in southwest Missouri. Let's take a look at and see what Sherry has to share with us. I'm Patrick Byers, horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension, and I'm so excited to be out here in an elderberry planting and to be interviewing one of the most innovative elderberry growers that I know, and that's Sherry Hagenhoff. And Sherry, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about the farm?
Okay, hi, I'm Sherry Hagenhoff, and this is Sac River Valley Elderberry and Elderflower Farm. And we are just nestled literally on the Little Sac River. We've been here since 2015 is when we started preparing and planting, and this is our third season for a good solid harvest. In the first season to have everything in production that we're harvesting.
So how many plants do you have here?
We have roughly 2,800 plants.
Okay. Now, elderberry is a relatively new crop for southwest Missouri, and your farm is kind of leading the way as far as showing the potential for this crop here. But what first got you interested in elderberry?
Well, I actually had really significant improvements in my health by some of the things that I did and myself using other things besides elderberries, but I began to see the potential for eating right and doing the right things, and I started researching, and I saw the potential for elderberry as not only a way for us to make a little money on our couple acres that we have available, but also just to provide something very healthy for our community and different, and we like a challenge. My husband and I are hard workers, so.
Well, it certainly shows in what you've developed here in a relatively short period of time. So again, the farm's relatively young, but if you don't mind, kind of talk about the different cultivars you have here and how the planting is laid out.
Okay, well, the very first things that we planted to start with were Bob Gordon and ranch and a little bit of wildwood. We put out like 500 ranch plants to start, 350 Bob Gordon and 200 of wildwood. That was our first plantings. We then 18 months ago, we also added Adams to that, and we added Pocahontas, the newest and greatest.
The newest and greatest.
Yes, and so this is the second summer for the newest plants to be in production. So.
Very good. Well, it's a nice mix of different cultivars. It gives you more of a spread out season. Very good. So I'm curious, you've got the farm underway, you're harvesting elderberries, you're in business in essence. What would you see as some of the challenges to growing elderberries here in southwest Missouri?
I think in the very beginning, it was the agriculture industry that would support us, providing what we needed. We weren't sure all the things that we needed in the way of irrigation and prepping and just what materials we needed, so we really relied on NRCS, we really relied on the extension, we relied on the businesses that we were dealing with to educate us and to help us understand what we needed and we had to learn how to describe what we needed. But so one was our agricultural suppliers, communicating with them and just getting everything out there. We could not just go up into Springfield, Missouri and get the products that we needed. We found out we had to literally go to certain places to get what we needed. Also, I think all along labor has always been an issue. To find qualified people, people with the energy and the stamina, it's intense. So finding people who could come and get the job done and kind of make a win-win situation where they were at least making some decent money, but also for us to be able to afford it, and in the beginning we did a lot more of the work ourselves. The machinery, finding the machinery that would cut time and help with production as well. We slowly built up. We didn't go into a lot of debt, so we had to build up what supplies we had to process everything. So I think that the labor, the machinery, and the ag industry supporting us, and I think those were really the bigger ones.
So tell me about how you market the crop.
Okay, I was very transparent and very real, and I call myself Sherry Plain and Small. From the very beginning, I just shared from my heart, this is our dream, and come along with us. And more and more people started following along, and just kind of seeing from planting or putting out compost and tilling rows and putting in little sticks in the ground, and I've just really invited everybody to follow us, and as that grew, more and more people became aware of us. I literally have a Facebook page that I do that with, and I was still working at the time full-time, so I just quit that last October, so it's been a nice hefty balance to try to get everything done. But I post on Facebook when we have our berries available for sale. I post on Craigslist, and word of mouth has really grown for us. And we sell frozen, destemmed wash berries. I'm a DIY girl, and it appeals to me to try to provide. I thought if people are buying dried and imported berries, why wouldn't they want locally grown even more? And so for those DIY folks like myself, I've sold berries to them and shown them how to make. I've done classes, how do you make products with those berries, and just shown them all the possibilities. So
that's excellent. So you touched on a chord that I think is really important, and that's sort of developing community around a new crop like elderberry. And through your Facebook presence, your social media presence, you've been a leader, quite frankly, in helping develop elderberries here in Southwest Missouri. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I do network with area growers. My husband and I know how painful it was to get started and learn everything, and so as we would go to conferences at River Hills Harvest and work with you folks, we really reached out and hugged on to the folks that are nearby us so that we could provide them the support that we could. We also we have workshops here for area farmers. We just try to get everybody together so everybody knows what is available, what they need to do. Many of them have come and done work days and worked here through the summer. We have had some out-of-state folks come and visit, but we're a nice tight-knit community here in Southwest Missouri. We have a Southwest Missouri pod. We have a Facebook group for that. We've just tried to share knowledge. Everybody has something to contribute, and that's the wonderful thing. Everybody has something they know more about, and so we give opportunities for people to speak up and share what they know, and we've shared from our mistakes to our failures to our successes. And so that's huge, and I appreciate the role that you played in helping grow our industry here in Southwest Missouri. So what do you think the future looks like for Sac River elderberries? Well, I've got to keep employees. There's no way, we have 3 acres. There is no way we could do all the work, the harvesting, and right now we hire folks mainly to help with harvesting, and my husband and I do all the processing. I hope we will just continue to increase our volume of berries over time, but I also hope that we can continue also just to provide the frozen elderberries. We are starting to go into producing some added value market products, and so we'll get those out there and start pushing those out to the public. But I hope we're here. This is a retirement thing for my husband and I. Like I said, I quit working full-time in October. He's got a couple years, and he'll be able to back off of work. And so hopefully it'll be an intense month of the year during harvest for us every year after this. But I do hope that we'll be around and we can keep. It's cool when we can employ area youth and give them a job, and their parents are all thrilled and love it that this is the kind of work they can find to do. They're all learning. And I tell you, I can't say enough for just the community of people, from our customers to our elderberry grower friends, and around the world. I mean, we've had a visitor here from England. We've had visitors here from, like I said, all different states: Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and we just hope that we can continue to share what we've learned, and we just hope to continue to support the industry.
Oh, that's fabulous. And people, of course, can follow your progress on your Facebook page.
Yes,
What,
yes.
what is the address of that?
It's Sauk River Valley, Elderberry, and Elderflower Farm.
Very
and
good.
yeah, they're on Facebook.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for the interview, Sherry. This has been fabulous. Thank you for sharing the story of Sauk River, Elderberry, and Elderflower Farm.
Well, we're happy to do it always. Thank you.
There are 3 species of elderberry that are of interest from the standpoint of commercial production. In the United States, the American elderberry is the native elderberry of the eastern part of the country. Botanically, it's Sambucus nigra canadensis. The European or black elderberry is widespread in Europe and in Asia, Sambucus nigra. And the blue elderberry, found along the west coast of the United States, Sambucus nigra caerulea. The American elderberry is the elderberry of primary importance for the eastern U.S. This particular species of elderberry is found across much of eastern North America, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Rocky Mountains, and then from the Gulf Coast north into Canada. And in its native habitat, it forms a medium to large shrub to a small tree. It's prominent when it's flowering in June, and you can see in this slide the picture of the shrubs in blossom. They also produce clusters of dark purple-black fruit. The leaves are pinnately compound, and even during the dormant season, elderberry is easy to identify, as the woody parts of the plant have these raised bumps on the twigs and branches called lenticels. The elderberry is of growing commercial interest. Historically, elderberry was harvested primarily from wild plants and used to make jellies and jams. But in more recent years, we've seen not only a renewed interest in jellies and jams, but also interest in a variety of other products developed from both the flowers and the berries. These include, yes, jelly and jam, but also wine, beer, and spirits, health supplements, and food colorants. In thinking about a good site for elderberry production, first of all, of course, consider marketing. Elderberry is a processing berry, and the markets are somewhat limited for this particular berry. So it's very important to consider the potential marketing outlets for elderberry at the site. If the grower is interested in organic production, there may be some considerations that are unique to organic production. For example, neighboring land uses. Elderberry will need to be irrigated, so be sure that there is adequate irrigation of water, first of all of quantity, but also of the appropriate quality. Good elderberry sites are elevated relative to surrounding lands, and consider the previous uses of the site. It'll be obviously less expensive to prepare a site that is in row crops or pastures for elderberry compared to a site that is in timber. Let's turn our attention to elderberry cultivars. Historically, the improved elderberry development began with the work of William Adams in the 1920s in New York. And through his efforts, Adams 1 and Adams 2 were developed, and then later York, which was a cross of Adams 2 and another type of elderberry. Both of these types have been planted in Missouri. Both of these types have performed well. Another effort to develop improved elderberry cultivars took place in Kentville, Nova Scotia in the 50s and early 60s. And a number of cultivars were developed in that program, including Johns, Kent, Nova Scotia, and Victoria. Recently, the University of Missouri and Missouri State University Elderberry Development Program has released a series of elderberries that are adapted to Midwestern production. And these include Bob Gordon and Wildwood, and more recently Pocahontas. A cultivar called Ranch was also developed in this program. If growers are interested in European elderberry production, Hochburg is the leading cultivar worldwide, but an adapted cultivar coming from the Missouri Elderberry Development Program is Marge, released in 2013 and well suited for production in the Midwest. There are also a series of cultivars developed in Denmark that may have application in North America. Elderberries are commonly propagated from hardwood cuttings. These cuttings typically are 2 to 3 nodes in length. They're collected while the plants are dormant, generally in January or early February, and then the cuttings are stuck in early spring. They may be stuck into pots or they may be stuck directly into the soil. The next slide and video will illustrate the collection of dormant hardwood cuttings. Now let's turn our attention to elderberry establishment. And the first thing to consider is planting layout. An elderberry planting, of course, is a perennial planting. It's going to be here for a long time, and it's important to lay it out properly. Generally, the best elderberry sites are elevated sites above lower ground, so the cold air moves off of the elderberry planting into other areas. When planning the actual layout of the planting, keep in mind that if you have several rows of plants, they should follow the contour of the slope. That way you reduce any possibility of erosion soil loss by having the plants running along the contour of the slope. And then when you lay out the rows themselves, keep in mind that the rows should be 10 to 12 feet apart, as we see in this planting here, and that the plants within the row should be 2 to 4 feet apart. Elderberries may be established from either bare root or container-grown plants, as we see in this picture here. Elderberry plantings may also be developed by taking cuttings and directly sticking them into the soil, again, as the center photo and lower photo illustrate. Now let's discuss elderberry pruning. Pruning elderberries is pretty straightforward. In Missouri, many farmers are managing elderberries by cutting the plants back to the ground during the dormant season, which would typically be in January or February. And the plants respond by sending up strong shoots from the base of the plant or even from the crown of the plant, and these typically are unbranched. They grow up, they're pretty much uniform in height, and each branch will be crowned with a cluster of flowers and eventually berries. The next topic to discuss is weed management in elderberry. Growers contemplating a new elderberry planting should be very conscious of weed management. The first step is to control problem weeds before you plant the elderberries, and particularly if you have weeds such as Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, poison ivy, wild blackberries, and other perennial troublesome weeds, eliminate those before you plant. Now, with the planting in place, there are several things to consider. You typically have 3 zones of weed management to think about. The first is the area underneath the elderberry plants. The second is the area between the rows. And then the third is the interface between those 2 areas. So let's talk about the area between the rows first. Generally with elderberries, the area between the rows is maintained in some sort of permanent perennial crop. For example, a non-invasive grass could be used there. And then it's kept under control by mowing. The area under the plants, traditionally weeds were managed by using mulches, but increasingly growers are turning to the use of landscape fabric. This is a woven material that allows air and water to pass through it. It's durable enough that it will be in place generally for 8 to 10 years, and it does a fabulous job of weed control. Now with this landscape fabric, it's important to open up an area for the elderberry plants to grow. And this is frequently done by actually burning a hole in the fabric. And then it's also important to have some sort of irrigation system to provide water to this area. But the combination of the weed barrier fabric and the small hole around each plant helps control weeds under the plants. The third area is the interface between the row middles and the area under the plants. And this area can be managed by using a selective herbicide, or it can be managed by using some sort of way of mowing the weeds that grow up at this interface. Elderberries will need supplemental irrigation during dry periods, and drip or trickle irrigation systems work well. Typically, a system includes 18-millimeter tubes with emitters every 18 to 24 inches, and an elderberry plant needs about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of water per week. Elderberries are commonly irrigated with drip systems. This is a very efficient way to water a perennial plant like an elderberry. It puts the water exactly where the plant needs it, which is at the root system. It's also a more or less permanent installation. The type of tubing that's used for a perennial crop like elderberry is generally rated for 6 to 10 years of life. Now this particular type of drip irrigation has the emitters molded into the line. Here's an emitter right here, here's an emitter right here. And they are at intervals down the line. Typically with elderberry, the interval between emitters will be 18 to 24 inches. And it's important when these are laid down that the emitters be facing up. The irrigation line can be placed on top of the landscape fabric as we see here, or it can be placed underneath the fabric. If it's on top, of course, it's easy to see and maintain. If it's underneath the fabric, it's actually protected to some degree from damage. Elderberries are heavy feeders from the standpoint of nitrogen, particularly if the plant is cut back to the ground annually. Research and growers' experience suggests that 60 to 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre will be needed for plants on a 4x12 spacing. And this fertilizer is typically applied in the spring as growth begins. Other nutrients may also be required. Soil testing is recommended when establishing an elderberry planting to supplement nutrients if necessary, and at intervals during the life of the planting to monitor nutrient status. Foliar sampling is another way to monitor elderberry nutrition. Elderberries have several pests of consideration. First of all, erified mite, as shown in the upper picture. This tiny mite can cause damage to the foliage and to the blossoms. The Japanese beetle, shown in the middle picture, feeds on the foliage and developing shoots of elderberry. And spotted-winged Drosophila is a problem in the berries as they begin to ripen. Information on managing these pests is available from the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry and also in the publication Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri. Several diseases of consequence are present in Missouri. Bacterial leaf spot can cause purpling of the foliage and loss of leaves. Phoma can cause shoot death and sometimes entire plant death. And elderberry rust can cause deformation of the fruit stems, the leaves, and the shoots of the elderberry. Again, management of these diseases, more information is found in the publication Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri. Deer are certainly a consideration for management of elderberries, and a planting should be established with deer management practices in place. These can range from electrified 2-wire fences all the way to substantial fences that include woven wire, electrified strands, and a height of 6 to 8 feet. The elderberry blossom harvest takes place in June when the plants are in full flower. The blossoms are harvested when all the florets in the cluster are open. The florets may be removed by rubbing over a screen, or they can be snipped off from the clusters individually. The blossoms should be used immediately, or they can be frozen for later use, or what is most common is that they are dried for future use. Elderberry harvest takes place in July and August in Missouri. And the plants are harvested, the berries are harvested when all the berries within the cluster are fully colored. Generally, there's 2 to 3 pickings for plants that have been pruned back to the ground. As elderberries ripen, they progress from green berries, as we see here, to eventually a dark purple-black in color when the berries are ripe. Now, elderberries are commonly harvested using visual cues. In other words, all the berries within the umbel are fully colored. We can see in this umbel there's still a few green berries, and that's fine. This would still be at the point where it could be harvested. But increasingly, growers are using measurements of sugar content and acidity to help guide harvest decisions. At any rate, when the berries are ready to harvest, the entire cyme is cut and then it's taken back for processing, typically destemming, and then the berries are washed, sanitized, and then frozen. Elderberry yields build during the first 3 years of the plant's life. An expected yield in the year after planting is 1 pound of berries per plant. In the second year of production, 3 pounds of berries per plant, and the plants will be in mature yield by the 3rd to 4th year of production. This typically is 5 pounds of berries per plant. High yields in Missouri have been in the range of 10 pounds of berries per plant. Upon harvest, the fruit is destemmed. Here is the elderberry processing. So the harvested cymes are brought in. You can see them in the lug here. They're then destemmed. This is an example of a destemmer here. It has the screen on top to vibrate. The berries and the cymes are moved around until all the berries have been sheared off by the movement of the screen. The berries then drop down and are caught below the destemmer. Following destemming, the fruit is washed and sanitized. So now we're going to go through the process of sanitizing the berries, and we have a 3-bay sink set up. The first dip will be into a sanitizing solution. Sherry's tested the concentration of the solution. She knows what it is. And then after that, the berries will move into 2 rinses, and then they'll be brought out for draining. So these are the berries as they have come from the destemmer.
Yes, they are.
And again, there's some green berries mixed in there. There's stems mixed in there. There may be some stink bugs mixed in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this step is really important because it helps separate the berries that don't make quality standards from the berries that do make quality standards.
Yes, they sure do. I like to, this is just really about rinsing that bleach off and seeing what else wants to come to the top. I don't spin forever here. I really don't spin forever in the first sink either, but I'll pull these out now. It's shocking the amount of stem that could be in here, and I really drain super well here because I don't want to put water weight in my bags. My customers are paying for berries, not water.
After the fruit has been destemmed, washed, and sanitized, it is typically stored. Elderberries can be stored for short periods of time as fresh berries, but are more commonly packaged and then frozen. Once the elderberry crop has been harvested, destemmed, sanitized, and cleaned, frequently the berries are held frozen for long periods of time until processing or until sales. An example here at Sac River Elderberry Farm, in a deep freeze, the berries are held here. They're packaged in gallon-sized bags, and then these berries are held at temperatures between 0 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and they'll maintain their quality for at least 2 years if held continuously frozen. In-depth information on elderberry production and marketing is found in the publication Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri. This is available from the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry at their website as a free downloadable PDF. For more information on elderberries, please feel free to reach out to Patrick Byers at the email and the telephone number here on the slide. I'd be very excited to share with you information on growing elderberries as a profitable and sustainable crop for Missouri. Okay, Anna, at this point, let's tackle any questions that might be in the question and answer.
Okay, we have 4 right now. So the first one asks, do I need more than 1 plant for good fruit production?
So the answer to that is not necessarily. In our research work, we've noted that isolated elderberries will set fruit, but there does seem to be a need for cross-pollination for maximizing productivity with elderberries. So it's always a good practice to plant more than 1 cultivar in your garden or on your farm. And in fact, we typically recommend 2 to 3 cultivars to spread the season out a bit and to provide for cross-pollination.
Okay. Another question, is pruning to the ground a good idea in northern states, as an example, zone 4?
We have some questions as to how far north you can take this pruning approach, because it does take a while to grow the plant back up, and the flowering and the harvest is later on plants that have been cut back to the ground. We've had collaborators in Maine and Quebec who have reported that cutting back to the ground may not be a good idea. So keep in mind that this approach was developed in the Midwest in somewhere between zone 6B and zone 4. And if you were to go much further north of that, then likely cutting to the ground may not work. In that case, you'll want to focus on more of a horticultural pruning where you just remove the older dead shoots and any parts of the plant that are twiggy and aren't very productive. So again, be cautious about moving too far north with the idea of cutting these plants back to the ground.
Okay. Okay. Another question. Can you use leaves to mulch with?
Yes, you can use leaves to mulch elderberry plants. In fact, you can use almost any organic mulch, things such as rotted sawdust, bark chips, rotted straw, leaves, compost. All of these materials are good for mulching elderberries. Be a little cautious about putting too thick of a layer over the top of the plants, though. probably not more than about 2 to 4 inches over the top of the plants themselves, but you can put a thicker layer along the edges of the plants or along the edges of the row.
Okay, other question. What do they use the blossoms for?
Blossoms have a number of uses. They're first of all, they're very aromatic. They have a wonderful fragrance. They also have an abundant amount of pollen present. And they're used in products where you can take advantage of both of those characteristics. They're used in their dried form to make teas. They're also used in their dried form to make enhanced waters and to make as a ingredient in things such as energy bars and salad dressings. The fresh blossoms can be used to flavor liqueurs and wine, and the fresh blossoms have also been used in enhanced waters. So a number of different uses for the elderflower.
Okay. Is it feasible to grow a few plants in a home garden setting?
It is. Elderberry is an excellent landscape plant. I mean, it just is naturally a beautiful plant. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a beneficial plant from the standpoint of supporting populations of pollinators and beneficial insects. So yes, by all means, plant elderberries in the home landscape.
Okay. Is it necessary to have more than one cultivar?
Our preliminary work in looking at the pollination needs of elderberry suggests that it is helpful to have more than one cultivar. We're actually involved in some research work now to try to pin down the exact answer to that question. Elderberries are insect pollinated, but there also seems to be some evidence that there is wind pollination at work as well. But for best crops, it's good to plant more than one cultivar in the home garden or on the farm.
And in a similar question, could you rank the cultivars?
Well, from the standpoint of ranking, there are different things to consider. First of all, when do you want to harvest your elderberries? If we were to go, let's look at the Missouri elderberry cultivars, for example. The earliest is Ranch, and that's followed by Bob Gordon, which is followed by Wildwood, which is followed by Pocahontas. If we were to look at attributes such as productivity, in general, the most productive cultivars have been Wildwood and Pocahontas. If, however, you're interested in consistent production and a cultivar that is widely adapted, then Bob Gordon fits the bill nicely for that. So as far as ranking them, it's a little difficult to say this is my absolute favorite, but there's an elderberry for almost every situation.
Okay. I have a few questions about pruning, so I'll read them all so you can answer them.
Okay.
Number one, should I prune to the ground? I've just been pruning the top foot or so. So that's the first question. The second is wondering if there would be any advantages to not pruning the plants down to the ground, but pruning them like blueberries, as an example, taking out old whips. And then the last pruning question, I have to find it. Did you say yes to prune them to the ground every year here in Missouri?
We have widely adapted the use of or the practice of pruning elderberries to the ground. It's a very efficient way to prune. It also leads to a condensed harvest season and larger clusters of blossoms or fruit. And so these are all positives from the standpoint of growing elderberries commercially. Now, I will say that not all types of elderberries respond well to annual pruning. I mean, for example, if you were going to propagate wild elderberries and bring them into your garden, you would have to go through a trial and error process to see if this approach will work for you. Now, there was a question about pruning them like blueberries. With American elderberry, the shoots don't remain productive longer than about 2 to 3 years. And so this annual renewal is actually helpful in keeping the bush healthy. Now, if you're growing European elderberry, we need to talk because it's a different pruning strategy. With European elderberries, they produce blossoms and fruit on 2-year-old shoots. So you can't prune these back to the ground every year. What you do is after a shoot has had blossoms and fruit on, you prune that shoot out, and then you save the shoots that grew that same growing season that didn't have flowers and fruit on for next year's crop. So again, it depends to some extent on what type of elderberry you're growing, which cultivar of elderberry you're growing. But this approach has worked quite well, pruning back to the ground for many types of American elderberry here in the Midwest. And yes, it is done annually.
Okay. Another question. What is the concentration of bleach for sanitizing? Is it a chlorine bleach?
So the bleach that is used for sanitizing is a food grade chlorine-based bleach. And it's very important to check the label before you use a bleach product to make sure that it says on the label for contact with fresh fruits and vegetables. Not all bleaches have that on the label. And if they don't, then you don't want to use that bleach. And there'll be information on the label as far as the concentration to mix up specifically for sanitizing berries. So I'll refer you to the label for specifics on what that concentration is. It varies with the strength of bleach that you're using.
Okay. Another question. What are the best practices when storing cuttings until spring?
The best practices when storing cuttings is, first of all, collect those cuttings before they begin to break bud. So you'll be collecting typically in January. Then place the cuttings into a sealed plastic bag. You know, one of the types that have the Ziploc type seals are helpful. Don't put any sort of moistening material. Don't put peat moss. Don't put anything else in there with it. Just put the cuttings as you've collected them into the plastic bags and then store them in the refrigerator at about, well, somewhere between 35 to 40 degrees. And they'll hold nicely until it's time to stick the cuttings in March.
Okay. Do you get more production by cutting to the ground?
In our research trials, we actually saw a little bit of a decrease in production cutting to the ground compared to not cutting to the ground. But on the other hand, the efficiency of management offset that slight dip in yield. Again, it's much more efficient for a farmer to grow them, cut them to the ground, and then manage the plants for a condensed harvest season and fewer but larger clusters of berries or fruit. So even though there might be a bit of a dip in overall production, it's more than offset by the reduced cost of managing that berry or flower crop.
Okay. We have quite a few questions, so just let me know whenever you need to.
Oh, let's keep going. This is great.
Okay, great. Next question. I have wild elderberries here in southern Pennsylvania, I think. I noticed the berries didn't make it to maturity last year. They dried up. So I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement, but.
Well, we've seen some problems with the loss of berries in Missouri as well. And in a hot growing season, this can be a problem, particularly if it's hot as the berries begin to ripen. There are also situations that we feel are related to pollination that can cause berries to shatter before they mature and ripen. There's also indications that the insect pest spotted-winged Drosophila can cause berries to shrivel and drop off the plant. So I feel it's probably one of those three scenarios. It's possible it may be something else, but that's what we've noted at this point.
Okay. When taking foliar samples, is there a target comparable crop that should be used to analyze nutrients?
So we still need to learn more about looking at the nutrient content of leaf samples and relating that back to the management of nutrition in elderberry. We've done some preliminary work. We have some what we feel are useful sufficiency levels for elderberry. And so if the person is interested in knowing what those are, please reach out and I can share that with you. We've seen some differences in sampling times for different types of elements. A good time to sample seems to be the period of time after the new shoots have grown to about 3 to 4 feet in height, and you have fully expanded leaves, collecting leaves from those new shoots for plants that have been cut back to the ground. But there are other nutrients that are actually more stable in their levels as you get closer to a berry harvest. So again, for more information on that, please reach out. It's always difficult to take one crop and try to relate it to sufficiency levels in another crop because you just don't know if that's really a good comparison. So I hesitate to say that elderberries are like any other fruit crop.
Is it normal practice to harvest blossoms and harvest berries later from the same plant, or is it one or the other for each plant? And what are the blossoms used for?
We've actually done research work looking at the harvest of both blossoms and berries from the same plant. And in our trials in the cultivars that we looked at, we felt we could harvest up to 15% of the blossoms without seeing a significant dip in yield. The plant seems to compensate to some extent. And some types of elderberries actually produce secondary shoots on either side of the main flower cluster, and these smaller secondary shoots will have later flower clusters. And we feel that those later clusters could be harvested, allowing the center cluster to develop into a berry crop.
Okay. More of a technical question. Patrick, would it be okay if we turned on our cameras while we're just asking questions?
I'm not quite sure how to do that with the webinar approach here.
For us, for just me and you.
Oh, you want to see me? Oh, okay. Well,
We've had a request. Yep.
there you go.
Here we are.
Very
Appreciate
good.
that. All right. On to the next question. Is there a specific type that you would recommend for making medicinal syrup?
Well, you know, in our trials, we've looked at a number of different cultivars looking at various helpful compounds, particularly things like anthocyanins. I'm drawing a blank. There's a suite of compounds that we've looked at, and we have found these compounds in every type of elderberry that we've looked at. Now, one thing is interesting. We did a study several years ago comparing the same cultivars in Missouri compared to Oregon. And Oregon, in Western Oregon, is a milder climate. And we actually found that the elderberries growing under the adverse conditions, quite frankly, of Missouri had higher levels of some of these compounds. So I suspect these compounds are formed in response to stress. But that being said, every elderberry that we've looked at has had some degree of healthful compounds in it.
Okay. Another question. In a home setting where I only need enough harvest for small batches, do I really need to prune back to the ground each year? My elderberries are along my backyard fence line.
In a home planting, of course, you know, you're not as concerned about efficiency of management. And so you can certainly manage elderberries as more of a perennial woody shrub in a home setting. And some types of elderberries will persist quite nicely, but I suspect at some point you'll want to prune out some of those older shoots periodically just to keep the bush in good production over time.
Are there any plants I should avoid growing near elderberry?
Elderberries don't seem to do particularly well under American black walnut. I think there may be some of that relationship between the juglone released by the black walnut roots and the elderberry plant. But in general, most plants grow quite well in the neighborhood of elderberries. Keep in mind that elderberries are full sun plants. And yes, they will grow well in partial shade, particularly under sort of dappled high shade. But in general, they perform best in full sun.
Okay. If I harvest cuttings from wild bushes along the river and tree line, is there any way to know exactly what strain I'm dealing with?
No, the answer is no. Again, recognize that elderberry is amazingly diverse, genetically speaking. We did an interesting study several years ago where we had collaborators send us elderberries from all up and down the eastern seaboard. We grew them out in a planting altogether, and it was just amazing for me to see how diverse this plant is in terms of the height of the bush, the spread of the bush, the number of leaflets on a leaf, the size of the fruit clusters, the size of the flower clusters. So if you're harvesting cuttings from a wild plant, there's no telling what you're getting. Now, keep in mind that cultivars like Bob Gordon and Wildwood came from wild plants. Those were wild plants that someone recognized as having merit. They provided them to our project, and after extensive trial, we decided they were good enough to be given a name and then released for farmers to grow commercially.
Okay. Do elderberries produce any nectar for honeybees?
Elderberries do produce a slight amount of nectar, but they're not a particularly good nectar plant from the standpoint of honeybees. Now, they are an excellent pollen plant. And keep in mind that pollen is just as important to nurture honeybee health as nectar is to produce honey. So from that standpoint, they're an extremely valuable plant in the landscape.
Do the birds eat the berries where you would have to put nets up to protect them?
In our research plots, we typically do nets just so we can get a good yield, measurement of yield on plants. Birds will feed on elderberries. It's interesting. There are different ways that the berries are held on different cultivars. And those cultivars where the berry clusters hang in a downward fashion are less likely to be predated by birds. Whereas those plants that hold their berries in an upright position, the birds will perch underneath the berries and just eat them all. So we tend to favor in our development program those cultivars that have berry clusters that hang down.
Okay. There wasn't sound on the cutting section video. What are we looking for one to buds?
Yes. I'm sorry, that video was actually shot without sound. So what you're looking for is shoots that grew the previous year. You know, if you cut your plants back down to the ground, those nice shoots that grow are perfect cutting wood the next winter. but you're looking for shoots that are 1 year old, and you want to collect 2 or 3 node cuttings. And you always want to remember which is the lower node and which is the upper node, because when you stick the cuttings, they have to be stuck in the proper orientation. If you flip them upside down, they just won't grow. So 2 or 3 node cuttings, and then when you stick them, you want to bury the lowermost node, or if you have a 3 node cutting, bury the lower 2 nodes. And keep in mind, when I say nodes, there's actually 2 nodes present because elderberries have opposite leaves, but each area where nodes are present, that's what we call a node.
Where would I find centralized information on use or recipes for berries and or flowers?
You know, there are lots of websites available that can give you information on utilizing the berries. You know, as I said in the presentation video, you know, there's all kinds of uses for elderberry. And, you know, for example, a typical berry wine recipe, you can substitute elderberries for any other berry. If you're going to make wine with elderberries, you have to have a feel for what the sugar content is of the juice. Typically, elderberries are around 11 to 12 degrees Brix. And then knowing that, you just know how much sugar you need to add. But yes, there are lots of recipes available in various places on the internet.
Great. Okay, a couple similar questions, I think. Where can I buy cuttings for the Pocahontas cultivar? That's one question. And the second is, I got my plants from the conservation in Licking. Do you know what kind they are?
So I'll tackle the second one first. Those plants were grown from seeds. Now, keep in mind, anytime you plant an elderberry seed and grow a plant, that plant is unique. You know, it has its own unique combination of genetic traits. And the plants that came from the conservation nursery in Licking, those are very diverse. They're not a particular cultivar. They're what we call seedling plants. And you could take 10 plants from there, plant them out in a row, and each one would be unique. So it's pretty cool to plant those. But again, if your goal is to grow a consistent, uniform crop, that's probably not the best way to do it. It's probably better to start with cuttings from 1 or 2 cultivars that you know something about. What was, the other question about Pocahontas cuttings. I will mention it's getting late in the season to find cuttings. The Pocahontas cultivar is newly released and the cutting supply is somewhat limited. You might check with River Hills Grower Supply. I don't know if they still have cuttings. Most of the other nurseries that I'm aware of that have Pocahontas have already sold out for this season.
Okay. What is the easiest way to protect part of my harvest from birds and squirrels? I don't mind letting them have the highest branches, but not all of it.
Well, the squirrels in particular are very troublesome and hard to discourage. I've had probably best luck having a small active dog in the neighborhood of the elderberries that can chase the squirrels away. Birds are best deterred by using a bird net that you place over the top of the plants. There are other ways to discourage birds, you know, with scare tactics and things like reflective mylar tape, those sorts of things, but they're generally not very applicable in a small home planting. In a small home planting of a manageable number of bushes, I would purchase a bird net and just place it over the top of the bushes.
Okay. What type are the native elderberry, and are they best for a small plot?
So the native elderberry are Sambucus nigra canadensis, our very own American elderberry. And they are excellent. I mean, it's a native plant. It's well adapted to its environment. They grow well. They can be productive if you select one of the improved types that I talked about in the video. But from the standpoint of planting them, if you're going to plant them in the home garden or on a farm, I would choose one of the cultivars. If your goal is to plant them as wildlife habitat, then it's just fine to plant seedling plants such as the conservation nursery supplies.
Okay. Should I cut back the larger portions of plant and encourage new growth, or allow these thicker woody parts of the plant to grow?
With American elderberry, at some point you'll want to remove those large, thick, woody shoots, because as time goes by, they become weaker and weaker. You know, if you're not planning to cut the plants back down to the ground, I would still practice an approach similar to blueberries, where every year you remove 1 or 2 of the very oldest shoots from your bush, just to encourage the development of new, vigorous shoots.
Okay. A few more questions about pruning. I'll ask them all kind of together.
Okay.
Do you suggest pruning the ground in the first year? What time of year should you prune? And with this weather right now, will it still work to prune right now?
So with 1-year-old plants, I typically don't prune those back. I let them grow 1 year, and then I'll have a a crop off of the shoots that overwinter, but after that first year, I do cut them back. With regards to the weather now, I think we're still just fine to cut shoots back. It's been a relatively cool winter, and I've not seen a great deal of bud development yet on elderberry, so I think it's still safe to cut them back. You basically want to cut the plants back before you see bud swell and development. And in a warm winter, that can happen very early. I've seen years where the 1st of February, we already have bud break and the development of shoots, and by then it's too late. So try to cut them back. Target January, given a choice. If you have to move into February, take a look at the plants and they'll tell you if you can still do it.
Okay. Although the most common propagation is through cuttings, is there any advice you would offer on starting from seeds?
Well, there are a number of ways to propagate elderberry. Cuttings certainly are probably the easiest way. You can also dig up root cuttings and propagate plants by digging up root cuttings. If you're using seed, the seed will need to be stratified, which means it has to undergo a cool, moist period before it will germinate. So collect the seed from your elderberry berries, and then put that seed, I tend to mix it with moist peat moss, and then put that seed into a Ziploc bag, put it into the refrigerator, and hold it there until probably the following March. And at that point, you can take the peat moss seed mixture and then plant it in pots or in flats. And you want to bury it about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch deep.
Okay. This is about a question we had earlier. It says River Hills provided cuttings as late as last week, including Pocahontas. So that is an option.
Thank you.
So we're looking into that. Okay, another question. Neem oil treatment for cuttings to eliminate possibility of mites?
Yes. The way the questions are coming at me, I don't know that we'll have time to actually get into our presentation. But one of the points I wanted to make on that is from the standpoint of mite management, there are a couple of things to consider. If you do prune the plants back to the ground every year and remove that woody material from your planting, you remove the overwintering site of the mites, because we've learned in our research projects that those mites overwinter in the buds near the tips of shoots. Now, if you are maintaining the plants as woody plants, then using something like neem oil or maybe even a dormant oil applied to the plants before they begin to show much in the way of bud growth may be helpful as well. We just don't know. No one's really looked into that from the standpoint of research, but that has been an effective way to control other species of mites on other types of fruit. So we feel that there may be some benefit there.
Okay, and you made a good point. I think some of these questions may be answered in your presentation, so that is an option. If you'd like to go through that and come back to questions later, it's really up to you.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and do that? And I noticed we have had a few people enter questions into the chat, so we'll want to take a quick look at that as well. But let's go ahead and go through the presentation. It's fairly brief, and I just wanted to highlight some points that we touched on in the video, but perhaps need a bit more discussion. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Okay, so just some quick thoughts on productivity, particularly if you're thinking about growing elderberries as a commercial crop. And we always want to maximize what we can harvest from a planting. And when we think about maximizing the production of a fruit crop, we certainly look at the genotype, which is the genetic background of the plant. We also look at the place in which we're growing that plant. And then the third part is us, the people who are actually growing it, and our expertise and our ability to respond to situations. And then we have to remember too that if our goal is profitability on the farm, then productivity is just one part. I've been hitting pretty hard on efficiency and why pruning back to the ground helps with efficiency, but it is important to think about efficiency and how that can reduce the cost to produce the crop. But other things to consider, of course, are financial management and marketing too. They're just as important as productivity. Now, when we think about selecting a good elderberry cultivar, we talked about all of these things already, and they're very important, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things relative to growth habit. So here we see a couple of different types of elderberry. This first picture is Bob Gordon. And Bob Gordon has one large flower cluster at the end of each shoot. And this is a nice example of what plants look like if they've been cut back completely. So these plants were cut back, and you can see all the growth that's taken place by the time they blossom, which is typically in mid to late June. So you have a large flower head there. You could harvest that flower head, but if you did so, you would harvest most of the potential berries that would be produced on that shoot. But on the other hand, you have all of these shoots. They're held about the same height with the flower or the fruit crop is. They're all about the same size. They're all about the same stage of development. They're all going to ripen about the same point. So again, a very uniform crop, very easy to harvest. Now this is wildwood. Wildwood has a different type of growth habit. It does have a large central flower cluster as we see here, but you can see those two side clusters developing. Those are going to flower later on, and they're actually going to give you more of a spread out berry harvest. But again, as I mentioned, there might be the potential of harvesting those side shoots for the flower crop. And our research has suggested that by doing so, you really don't affect the overall productivity of that plant. So again, you can get both a flower crop and a berry crop off the same type of elderberry if it does produce these side blossoms. Now, as far as productivity, it's important where you grow elderberries. And this is both from the standpoint of microclimate. We talked about adaptation of elderberry cultivars to particular areas, but also microclimate. Everyone's yard, everyone's garden, everyone's farm has areas where it's better suited for growing a crop like elderberries than other areas. We have to think about other things too in the environment, like freeze and frost damage, too much rain, pollination issues, hail, high temperatures. All of these are considerations to keep in mind. And this picture here, occasionally we get hail damage on elderberry, but this is one of the most damaging hailstorms I remember seeing. And you can actually see the broken shoots. It was just very devastating on those plants. And the hail came about the time they were flowering. So we lost the crop that year, but you can see that this particular cultivar is recovering quite nicely from the hail. The plants lived, and then the next winter we cut them back and regrew the plants the following year and had a good crop. A good elderberry site is in full sun, protected from high winds, and has a well-drained soil. Now, as far as cultural practices, these are the four things that we have felt to be particularly important from the standpoint of productivity. They're pruning, fertility management, site management, and irrigation. And we touched on these in the video, and I'll just briefly mention them again. So again, annual removal, it can certainly improve harvest efficiency. You get larger, fewer flower cymes. You get a concentrated ripening period. We do feel it's helpful for managing aryphied mites. Spotted wing Drosophila, we'll talk more about that here in a moment, but if your crop ripens uniformly and in a condensed period, you don't have to spray the fruit for as long a period of time to protect against spotted wing Drosophila. And I'm glad someone asked about northern growing areas, because we do have concerns that this approach will not work well in more northern growing areas. At least 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre for elderberries. And again, this of course can come from an organic source or from other sources as well, but they are heavy feeders, especially if you cut the plants back to the ground. We like the idea of planting on berms, especially if there's any question about drainage at a potential site, soil drainage. Plant them on berms, and we feel this is important in overall productivity. Keep in mind that elderberries are definitely not drought tolerant, and we talked about irrigation systems in the video. Here again, just to reinforce what I mentioned, 18 millimeter tubes should give you 6 to 10 years of life, and you want emitters about every 18 to 24 inches. Now, a few minutes on pests. These are some of the pests that we've seen on elderberries in Missouri, and they are listed in what we feel is sort of the order of precedence as far as their damage. Certainly, aryphied mites, spotted wing Drosophila, Japanese beetle can be a problem every year in almost every planting. Other insect pests, we may see them. In many cases, they're pretty incidental. On the disease side, we're not as concerned about elderberry diseases, except in particular instances where they might be present at a damaging level. But in most cases, we're more concerned about insect issues than we are about diseases. And then, of course, birds. So here's what aryphied mites do. They cause the distortion of the foliage, and they can damage the flower clusters as well. And when we think about managing aryphied mites, we talked about the idea of removing all of the woody shoots, which is where they survive the winter, and then possibly using an oil or some other type of spray to help during the dormant season. Spotted wing Drosophila is a fruit fly, lays its eggs in the berries. This is actually a blackberry, but it would be similar damage in an elderberry. And of course, elderberries are much smaller, and the presence of one larva in an elderberry will destroy the berry. Very important to keep your elderberries harvested on a timely basis. And then there are insecticides, both organic and non-organic, that can be used to control spotted wing Drosophila. And Japanese beetles can be troublesome. They do feed on elderberries, and they can destroy the foliage on the plants. In an organic farm or an organic garden, we advocate using a trap approach, trapping Japanese beetles off the elderberries. And our research has demonstrated that this does give adequate control. You have to have a number of traps. They have to be spaced around the planting, and you don't want more than about, maybe 25 to 50 feet between traps to see the benefit from trapping Japanese beetles. Occasionally, we see damage from elderberry sawfly, spindleworm, or elder borer, but again, these tend to be incidental pests. Elderberry rust is sometimes an issue. We talked about that in the video. It can distort the foliage, but typically we don't see it in damaging levels unless the alternate host, which is a type of sedge, is also present near the elderberry planting. Now, sedges tend to be plants that grow in moist areas, so elderberry plantings that are close to streams, lakes, ponds, those sorts of things, at least potentially might see higher levels of elderberry rust. This is bacterial leaf spot, and occasionally it can be a problem on elderberry as well. But again, we don't expect to see this every year, and in most years, it's not present in damaging levels. We are interested in elderberry viruses. We just don't know much about virus issues on elderberry. We are trying to find funding to do a survey of all the elderberry cultivars to see if viruses are present in them, and if so, can we clean them up? We also have some cooperative work going on with a nursery to try to develop some virus-free planting stock for elderberries. But again, stay tuned. We need to learn more about elderberry viruses. And then, of course, we've already discussed birds, and here we see our research plots that have a bird netting on them. Now, if you look at the lower picture, this is an example of the cultivars that have the clusters that are decumbent. You can see how the fruit heads hang down, and they're less likely to be damaged by birds. Looking at the upper picture, you see how those clusters are held more upright. Those are definitely more attractive to birds. Now, pest management, again, removal of woody stems after pruning, dormant applications of oil, keeping an eye out for things like spotted wing Drosophila and Japanese beetle, making sure that you harvest the berries and get all berries out of the planting. And then particularly for spotted wing Drosophila, it may be necessary to have a spray program. Weed management, we talked about that at length in the video, but again, the use of landscape barrier fabric can be very helpful from the standpoint of managing weeds, especially in plantings where herbicides are not an option. So more and more plantings are going in with landscape fabric. Now, the lower picture there shows a new elderberry planting just planted where plastic mulch was used. And in this case, the elderberry cuttings were pushed through the plastic into the prepared soil bed. And after a year, the plastic will be cut off and removed from the planting. At that point, of course, the elderberry plants will be well established. Harvest management, we talked about destemming and some of the other practices, and I just wanted to highlight the use of a more analytical approach to determining when to harvest elderberries. We've had some situations where elderberry processors have refused to accept shipments of berries because they were not harvested at the right stage. And if a processor needs berries of particular quality, they obviously can't make good quality products out of inferior berries. So it's very important to understand when to harvest the berries. Looking at these two side-by-side pictures, the upper picture shows elderberry cluster with green berries, and this obviously would not be a point at which you want to harvest. The lower picture, all the berries are nicely colored. This is historically or traditionally the point where we would harvest. But now I think we're getting to the point where we actually need to look at juice chemistry. And from the standpoint of elderberry, the components that we're interested in are the sugar levels, the acidity levels, and the juice pH. Same sort of parameters you would look at in harvesting a wine grape, for example. And it's very easy to analyze these juice characteristics. And then once you know that your berries meet the quality parameters of your processor, then you know when to harvest the berries. And here we see elderberry harvest underway. Destemming can be done with several things. We saw a vibrating destemmer in the video. This is an example of a grape destemmer that has been slightly modified, smaller holes on the cylinder there where my finger is, that will shear berries off of elderberry stems as well. And so that can be used to destem elderberries too. And there's the destemmer that we saw in action. So again, just to kind of highlight productivity, remember that it's not the same thing as profitability. You know, obviously experience and efficiency are important. You want to design a planting. If you're a farmer putting in elderberries, you want to design that planting from the get-go with productivity in mind. Choose your cultivars carefully. Keep in mind that all aspects of management will impact productivity. Pest management is becoming increasingly important with commercial elderberries and elderberries in the home garden as well. And then you can do everything right, but if you don't manage the crop correctly at harvest, you might harvest either inferior berries or you might lose the harvest. So again, very important from the standpoint of productivity to manage harvest well. As I said in the video, if you'd like to reach out and talk more about elderberries, I'd love to visit with you. Here's my contact information, and look forward to hearing from you as well. So I think at this point, we will stop screen sharing and we'll continue with questions. I think you're muted.
Yes, I was. Thank you. All right. Yes, we do have quite a few more questions, so we'll
Yes.
get right into it. Next question: neem oil treatment for cuttings to eliminate possibility of mites.
Yes, as I mentioned, we feel there may be some benefits to using either neem oil or perhaps a dormant oil for mite management. Keep in mind that the further out on the shoot that you go in collecting cuttings, the more likely you are to collect cuttings that actually have overwintering mites in them. And it's also important if you know, for example, that there are mite issues in a planting, you know, in a particular area, don't collect cuttings from that area, again, because that's where the mites will be present.
Okay. Is dormancy oil a good idea to use on elderberries?
I think if you're not going to cut the plants back to the ground, that a dormant oil would be helpful. Again, we just don't have research to demonstrate that that's the case like we do with other fruit crops. But again, it's just my feeling that from the standpoint of pest management, that dormant oil spray is very helpful.
Okay. Is there use of essential oils for the pests that you have mentioned?
I don't know anyone who has tried essential oil use on elderberries. So I have colleagues who are looking at essential oil use and managing pests on other horticultural crops. And so I think it may be something where there might be application. We just haven't tried it yet. So again, stay tuned. There's all kinds of research opportunities with this interesting crop.
Okay. When is the best time for treatment of cuttings? At time of storage or when planted?
If you're going to treat cuttings with a rooting powder, and I assume that's what we're talking about here, that should be done immediately before sticking the cuttings. You typically will take the cutting, dip the basal end, tap off any excess powder, and then stick the cutting.
Tell me more about destemming. I've used a fork to separate berries from stems. How can I increase removal process?
Well, if you're destemming a small quantity of berries, and particularly at home, what I advocate is taking the entire cluster and freezing it, and then you can very quickly shatter the berries off of the frozen clusters. They just come out beautifully. And then you can refreeze those berries, or you can use them at that point if you're ready to process then. Again, for larger quantities, it's just not practical to freeze them first and then destem and then freeze again. But in a home planting with a few bushes, that's an excellent way to destem berries.
Okay. A similar question: how do you get rid of the rosin that accumulates on the top of juice?
So you're talking about what we call the green goo. And the green goo gets stuck all over your utensils. It gets stuck in the containers that you're using. It gets stuck in your canner. We have found that you can remove the green goo by using something like peanut oil or any other type of oil. If you're trying to remove it from something like a refractometer, then I suggest using 90% isopropyl alcohol. That will take it off as well.
Okay. And a similar question: how important is it to totally destem the finished product?
Well, Yeah. So it's very hard to get complete destemming done. There's always a few small stems present. If you do a disinfecting dip or even just a dip in clean water, a good part of those stems will float away and you can separate them that way. I think it is important from the standpoint of the quality of the finished product to remove as many of the stems as possible. I don't know that there are any health risks to including a few stems, but it could lead to off flavors and things such as jellies or juices.
Okay. If you harvest the flowers, will you still get berries?
Well, as I mentioned, I think you can harvest a portion of your crop in flowers and still see berries. If you're growing an elderberry type that has those side shoots, you can certainly harvest the blossoms that develop on those side shoots and still see a good harvest from that central cluster, the larger cluster in the middle.
Okay. What would your advice be on growing on hillside, particularly west facing, with a drop of approximately 36 inches over 30 feet?
Well, I think that would be an excellent site to grow elderberries, again, assuming that you have at least a reasonably deep soil and that it's well drained. I would suggest planting on berms, and I would suggest running the berms along the contour of the slope so that the berm actually becomes a little mini terrace to help hold moisture and to keep from losing your soil from erosion. I've seen a number of plantings that have gone in on slope sites that have done very well with that approach.
Okay. Are elderberries prone to bagworms, and where can I find information on controlling Japanese beetles?
You know, occasionally I'll find a bagworm on an elderberry plant, but it doesn't seem to be as favored a host as, say, a juniper or something like that. As far as information on Japanese beetle management and elderberries, feel free to reach out to me. I can share the results of our research project looking at trapping using baited traps for Japanese beetle management. And there's also information on pesticides, either organic or non-organic, which will control Japanese beetle.
Okay. Are elderberries toxic if eaten raw? Is this true? And what's the consideration on this?
So there is quite a bit of concern about, back up a moment. If you go to the internet and do a search for elderberries, you'll come upon a number of sites that talk about toxicity in elderberries. And frequently it's a discussion related to cyanide. And we too are concerned about that. And we've done some research looking at the cyanide issue in elderberries, elderflowers, and other parts of the plant as well. And yes, there are cyanide precursors, various compounds that in the right setting could become cyanide. But typically for this to happen, there has to be an enzyme present to mediate the process. And in the elderberry, this enzyme is typically not present, or if it is, it's in very low amounts. And in our research work, we've been unable to quantify levels of cyanide that would pose health risks. In other words, to put it into layman's terms, you're more at risk drinking apple juice than you are eating elderberries. And so we're comfortable in recommending, that this is not a concern. We have a research paper that will be published here very soon that will outline the work that we've done in helping to understand the cyanide issue in elderberry.
Okay, and a similar question. I grew up hearing that parts of the elderberry plant are poisonous. What, if any, parts of the plant are considered poisonous?
Well, if we look at the blossoms and the fruit, again, we feel there's very little risk there. We in our cyanide studies, we looked at stems, the stems on the berries, and we looked also, I think, I'm trying to remember if we looked at foliage. It seems to me that we did. And we didn't find levels in those parts of the plant either. Now, I really can't speak to things like the woody stems, the roots, those parts of the plant, because I don't believe we investigated those. But from the standpoint of the blossoms and the fruit, we feel that there's very little risk relative to cyanide poisoning. Now, you always have to qualify that statement, because there are people who are sensitive to various things, and something that might make me ill might not make another person ill. And there are people who have sensitivities to elderberries, just as there are sensitivities to almost any other thing that we might eat. I have a friend, for example, who is sensitive to eating raw elderberries, and she doesn't do that. So keep that in mind. If you're new to elderberries, particularly raw elderberries, eat a few first and make sure that you're not one of those people who are sensitive to them.
Okay. Could you talk about marketing opportunities for farmers? We have no other elderberry growers in the area. What kind of pricing should we be looking at?
Well, elderberry historically has been a processing berry where a farmer would grow a crop and then sell it to a processor. In that setting, elderberries typically bring somewhere between $1 to $2 per pound for frozen destemmed berries. We're seeing some interest in vertical integration on farms where a farm would grow the elderberries and then make value-added products from them. And you may remember back to the video when Sherry was talking about developments at her farm. She's doing just that because oftentimes the value in the crop is in the product that you make from it. And so that's an option as well. There's also an option to sell frozen berries to the public rather than to a processor. And in that setting, they're more valuable than the $1 to $2 that I mentioned. And I will qualify that statement as far as what processors are willing to pay. During the COVID situation, there's been a groundswell of interest in elderberry, and we've seen a situation where the processors have been unable to meet the demand from the standpoint of processed products. And what this means is that the supply of frozen berries, typically we have about a year's supply of berries in cold storage, but that has been exhausted. To my knowledge, there are no berries available for purchase at this point. And what this meant earlier on in 2020 is that the crop that was available brought a premium price. I've heard prices in excess of $5 a pound, which is fabulous from the standpoint of farmers. So I think, we're in a situation now where the pricing is in a little bit of flux. Selling to the public, I would expect you could ask for $5 a pound for berries, for frozen berries selling to the public.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Another question. Do you have any experience with predator bird calls to help deter bird damage? My neighbor seems to have good luck using this one with his blueberries.
Yes, and I think a similar approach could be used. My experience with bird deterrence has been largely with blueberries. And I've worked with recorded bird distress calls. I've worked with screamer shells, cracker shells. I've worked with inflatables that shriek as they inflate. Also various other things that produce an audio effect. And I think that the same approach is used in blueberry would be effective in elderberry.
Okay. Can you tell us which varieties are determinate or indeterminate?
So indeterminate, wildwood is sort of the case study. But we feel the Pocahontas has at least some indeterminate aspect to it, perhaps not as pronounced as wildwood, and ranch has some indeterminate aspect to it as well. Bob Gordon is probably the most determinate of the cultivars that we've developed in our program. Adams seems to be somewhat indeterminate in its habit. I don't know that I can speak from experience with the Canadian cultivars. I just don't know. But the material that originated in our work here in the Midwest is both determinate and indeterminate. Okay. And when I use the term indeterminate, those are the cultivars that produce those side shoots.
Got it. All right, another question. Are there any plants that you suggest interplanting with elderberry?
Well, I think that if you choose a plant that can fit a niche that's present in an elderberry planting, I don't know that there are any that I would say don't plant. There are a number of farmers that have interplanted vegetable plants among elderberries, farmers that have interplanted cut flowers and other ornamental plants among elderberries. Keep in mind that as an elderberry planting matures, it will cast more and more shade, and so that becomes a consideration. Another consideration is how close your rows are. If you plant your rows 10 feet apart, the area between the rows will be definitely shaded by the time those plants are 4 to 5 years old. Wider spacing, you'll still have some sunlight in the middle of the rows, so you could interplant something in the middle of the row. Now, in an agroforestry setting or a setting, where you're interplanting plants from the standpoint of developing a perennial planting, elderberries can be planted amongst many other types of plants, and they become an important part of that second layer. The top layer being trees with high canopies, the next layer being the woody shrubs, and elderberries fit very nicely in that next layer in a perennial food forest type setting.
Okay. Can elderberries be successfully grown in pots rather than in the ground? And can you use a pot to control the size of the plant that way?
So elderberries are pretty robust plants. And if you were going to grow them in a pot and do it successfully, it would need to be a large pot. I've dug up plants that are 3 and 4 years old, and I've been astounded by the extent of their root systems. So they make a large root mass over time. If you put them into a smaller pot, obviously you would control growth by stunting the plant in essence. And so at least in theory that would work, but it definitely would negatively impact your berry crop. If you want to grow them happily in a container, it needs to be a large container, at least a 20-gallon container.
Okay. And a similar question, what are your thoughts on developing roots from nodes in a container of water before planting them?
I have rooted cuttings in water, and keep in mind that there is a transplant shock period of time when you take a cutting that's rooted in water and try to grow it in soil. The characteristics of a root grown in water are completely different than the characteristics of a root grown in a rooting media or in the soil. And so it takes a bit of time for the plant to recover from moving from the container of water into the soil. I think you'll see better results if you root those cuttings directly in pots of media or in the soil. It's not to say you can't root them in water, and it's not to say they won't survive, but I think you'll be happier with the results of directly rooting them in media or the soil.
Okay. Japanese beetle traps attract beetles. As such, how far from the plant should traps be placed?
That's a very good question. Traps should be placed around the perimeter of the planting, not within the planting. Your goal is to develop what's called a push-pull strategy, where you pull the beetles out of the planting and you're pushing the beetles that come from the outside into the traps. And so the traps should be in the perimeter around the plants. And again, as I mentioned, fairly close together, 25 to 50 feet apart. You want to have a large reservoir in which to catch the beetles, and you want to use pheromone lures that are more or less the commercial grade ones, not the ones that you would pick up at a home improvement store, but the ones that you would buy from a company like a Great Lakes IPM or Arbico or one of the suppliers for insect lures.
Very good. Do chicken runs help with the pests? And we also had a similar answer to that question in the comments. It says, my free-range chickens seem to help Japanese beetles numbers down.
Yes. Chickens will eat Japanese beetles. So will other fowl like turkeys and ducks. Keep in mind that those same fowl will eat berries too. So you don't want them present when the berries are ripening. And elderberry is a processed berry, so we don't have as many concerns about produce food safety and the risks of having animals close to berries. But even so, I think it would be a good practice to keep the various types of poultry out of the planting as you get close to harvest.
Okay. What time of year do you use dormant oil spray?
Dormant oil spray would be used before you begin to see bud development. So typically, it's going to go on sometime in February.
Okay.
Yeah, watch your plants. They'll tell you.
Sure. What is the demand for fresh flowers?
So one of our projects that's underway now is to get a feel for what the fresh flower market is. I don't know that anyone really knows. At the moment, it's definitely a small niche market. And oftentimes the people who are growing flowers from the standpoint of harvesting the flowers are vertically integrated. They're producing their own products from those flowers. There is some demand for dried elderberry from the standpoint of tea companies, those companies that are making various tea blends. So that would be one place to look. Something I'll mention, I forgot to mention it earlier, but we're seeing a growing interest in freeze-dried berries. And they make a very interesting kind of a crunchy, shelf-stable product that looks like an elderberry and tastes actually quite good. Dried elderberries, dehydrated elderberries, on the other hand, are very hard and leathery. And while they might have a place, say, in a trail mix or an energy bar, these freeze-dried elderberries are a very nice product. So again, a lot of interest in freeze-dried elderberries. But as far as the fresh flower market, I just don't have good data to share with you as far as the size of that market.
Okay. A similar question, what is the most in demand right now? Fresh berries versus dry berries versus pre-made juices and syrups?
I think right now, from the standpoint of the public, the pre-made juices, pre-made syrups, elderberry gummies, those sorts of things are in demand just because of the ease of handling them. But I will say that during the elderberry season this past year, there was, as I said, a groundswell of interest in elderberries and people making their own products at home rather than purchasing products that were made by elderberry processors. So there's demand in both places, of course.
Are any of the American cultivars safe to eat raw, or do they all need to be cooked?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that we have addressed the concern with cyanide. There, as I mentioned, there are people who have sensitivities to elderberries, and you want to be a little cautious about eating them raw if you've not done it before. I do know people who have sensitivities to raw elderberries and are able to consume products such as elderberry juice, elderberry wine, elderberry jelly without any issues. So again, try it out first to make sure. And I will say that raw elderberries, I mean, at least in my experience, are not particularly pleasant to eat. They have a somewhat of a tannic taste. It's not that exciting. I would much rather eat a product made from elderberries, where elderberries are one of the ingredients, rather than just eating a handful of raw elderberries.
Okay. Let's see. When should we start cutting in potting soil after collection in January?
I would start cuttings in March, probably sometime around the 15th of March.
Okay. Another question. Should we cut our elderberry plants down all the way to the ground between season, or simply prune back the bushes?
If you're going to cut them back to the ground, again, that would be done in January or early February. And again, it depends upon the type of elderberry you're growing and the desired cropping habit. For farmers, it's a very attractive way to manage elderberry. For home gardeners, if your goal is to have a woody shrub in the landscape, perhaps you don't want to cut the entire plant back down to the ground every year.
Okay. We have another comment about a question earlier. So this says, the dried flower tea is thought to be very good for respiratory issues, colds, flus, allergies, and other sinus problems. It's also said to be antiseptic and even claimed to reduce blood sugar levels. So some information there.
Yep, very interesting. We have research work underway at the University of Missouri looking at the consumption of elderberries and benefits related to brain health. So again, stay tuned. There'll be some interesting information coming out of those studies.
Very good. All right, another question. Should we cut our we already answered that one. Any thoughts on planting honeysuckle or other types of flowering plants to attract hummingbirds to eat SWD?
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. For example, I've worked with blackberry farmers, and SWD is spotted winged Drosophila, is very damaging on blackberries. And this particular farmer was using hummingbird feeders at the ends of the plant rows to attract hummingbirds into the planting. I was astounded by the number of hummingbirds that were present in that planting. And hummingbirds will eat the adult spotted winged Drosophila. It's kind of not commonly known that hummingbirds eat more than just nectar. They certainly eat insects, and in fact, the protein in insects is very important when the hummingbirds are feeding their young. And so they will eat spotted winged Drosophila. And if you can build up a population in the vicinity of your elderberry plants, that may be helpful. Whether or not they'll be able to adequately control spotted winged Drosophila, I think remains to be seen. It may take a lot of hummingbirds that are on double duty to do that job, but we typically enjoy hummingbirds anyway, so why not encourage higher populations in our yards and on our farms?
Sure. All right. I'm looking for an early ripening determinant variety elderberry. I already have Ranch and Bob Gordon. I'm fairly sure that I also have York and Adams too. Can you speak to any of the Canadian or New York cultivars that would fit that niche?
I have to confess, I don't have a huge amount of experience with the Canadian cultivars. For the most part, in our early trials, they just didn't do very well in Missouri. They seem to be more suited for the Northeast and then, of course, where they were developed in the maritime area in Canada. And so, if you were to ask me how do they fall as far as ripening, I suspect they're all mid-season. I don't think any of them were as early as ranch in our side-by-side trials. But again, the question that I just can't answer, I don't know how determinate they are. I just don't. So again, if you wanted an early ripening determinate cultivar, Bob Gordon would probably be your best bet for the most determinate cultivar that we have experience with. As I mentioned, ranch is somewhat indeterminate, but again, not to the degree, for example, that wildwood is.
Right. Are the seeds cooked after they're freeze-dried? And is there any concern of seed poisoning on freeze-dried berries?
Well, again, in our trials looking for cyanide issues, we looked at whole berries, and we looked at berries where the juice had been expressed. We didn't look straight seeds. That's a good point. But again, we are comfortable in saying that there's low risk from eating a freeze-dried product where the seeds are included in the berry. I have to confess that we did not look at dried seeds or the seeds themselves in our trial.
Okay. Let's see. Would you cut Sambus nigra to the ground in February?
Good question. I'm glad you brought that up. Sambucus nigra is the European elderberry, and it has a different fruiting habit than the American elderberry. It only fruits on shoots that are 2 years old. So in other words, you can't cut them to the ground every year. You would never see berries because you would never have 2-year-old shoots. So the way you handle European elderberries is you let them grow, and the 2-year-old shoots will have flowers and fruit on. And then that shoot is the shoot that you cut off the next winter, okay? Now, the same time that 2-year-old shoot it has fruits and flowers on, you also have 1-year-old shoots that are growing that don't have flowers or fruit on. And that 1-year-old shoot in year 1 will become next year's 2-year-old shoot, which will have your berries on. So you never have a shoot that's older than 2 years old in a European elderberry. But you can't cut them back to the ground, because if you do that, you'll never have 2-year-old shoots. So you'll never have fruits and berries. So if you're thinking about growing European elderberry, you want to sit for a while and think about this situation and come up with a plan. But again, reach out and I'd be happy to share some more thoughts on pruning European elderberry.
Very good. All right. Another pruning question. If we are also using the elderberry plants as landscaping ornaments in addition to small batch harvesting, will pruning them back to the ground prevent them from growing 6 to 10 feet and from being as attractive?
If you cut them back to the ground and it's a vigorous cultivar, you can easily get 6 feet of growth on them. And you may have seen that picture where we had people standing near those plants. Those plants were over their heads. And those were not short people. Those were people who were 5.5 or 6 feet tall. So yes, they will grow that much. It has to be a healthy plant, and it has to be one of the more vigorous cultivars. But yes, they will grow that much.
Okay, and we are all caught up on our questions right now.
Well, very good.
Great presentation, Susan says.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I think at this point we're after 8 o'clock, so we've used our time. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. This was just a very exciting presentation for me, and I really enjoyed the interaction too with all of the questions. And so please reach out if there's anything that I can do to help with your interest in elderberries. And this recording will be posted, and so it'll be available for checking out later on. And again, our publication, Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri, is sort of the sum total of 20 years of experience, all condensed down into publications. So check that out as well. So I think, Ann, at this point, we'll say goodnight and thank you all for joining.